we walked around both sides of 149th Street and farther west on many occasions. One little incident, it was a day in maybe March of one year, probably late 40s, very early 50s. And in the area west of 149th Street, a lot of the storm sewers were ditches alongside the road. And so whenever a sidewalk, a back alley, or a driveway crossed, there had to be a culvert so that the water could drain and not be blocked by the driveway or whatever it was. And of course, that time of year, things freeze and thaw all the time. And a number of them had frozen, and a culvert is the last thing to thaw naturally from the sunshine. And so that meant that during the day, water was being created by melting and then was backing up. And the municipal district of Stony Plain had a truck there with a boiler on the back. And it was ejecting steam into the culverts to thaw them. Mm. Now, the bigger, more general thing I remember was looking at houses under construction west of 149th Street. And just in general, all over Edmonton or west of there, people didn't have a lot of money, and they would tend to get their house in stages. So when a person with money who could afford to have a house built for him took possession of the house, it would always have an unfinished basement. If there was any sort of attic, that would be unfinished. There probably would be no hardwood flooring. There certainly would be no inlaid carpets, and probably no appliances. He'd have to go out to Eaton's or somewhere and buy his own appliances. Well, all that served doubly west of 149th Street because there was a lot of do-it-yourself carpentry involved. And what was very common west of 149th Street was that the first summer, people would have a basement of some sort dug, and I don't know exactly how, maybe a horse scraper, I just don't know. And they would have concrete foundation, in other words, 4 walls for the basement done. And it would presumably be a full basement. And it would be roofed over by what was going to be the main floor. And maybe a window put in. There'd obviously be some sort of a door. And that was it. That was all that was built the first summer. And for the first winter, people lived in the basement. So obviously they had proper plumbing and maybe some sort of appliance of some sort. They must have had a way to cook. Then in the spring, coming up for the second summer, the main floor would be roofed in. Probably it would be a one-story house, probably a 2-3 bedroom bungalow. And a lot of the framing usually requires a framing carpenter, but that might be done by the owner or his friends. And certainly putting the siding on the house would be done by them. And certainly putting in the insulation inside the walls would be done by them. And if you got an electrician to put in the wiring, that would be half a day or so. And the plumbing, again, wouldn't take much longer to install. And I don't know, you could go to a sash place and get the windows, I suppose, and have a door fitted. But a lot of that would be the labor of yourself or your family or your friends. And then the outside of it would probably be covered in tar paper. Not very beautiful, but done. And so that would be what you'd achieve during the second summer. and then your house would be pretty snug and comfortable and full size then, and of course a roof had been put on. And so that would be your second winter. Then the next year you would, or the one after, depending on how much money you had, you'd spend some money to get stucco put on the outside. And in those days, stucco always had embedded in it little pieces of broken beer and pop bottles. And then maybe that year or the next year, you would get some soil if you didn't have it. Now, developers and whoever didn't take away the topsoil then the way they did now, so it may be you had enough topsoil. If so, you'd buy some, but the topsoil was always infested with quackgrass. So for about 2 years, you would grow potatoes, especially in the front yard, and it's easy to weed them. It's work, but it can be done, and you gradually get rid of all the quackgrass and the quackgrass roots. And then after that, you maybe, if you have time, you put in a front lawn. But meanwhile, of course, the backyard, you dig all up and have a vegetable garden. And back in those days, almost every house had a vegetable garden in the back, whether the people had lots of money or no money. If you walked down back alleys in Edmonton, you were walking, both sides of the alley were vegetable gardens. Not so anymore, but back then, yes. In this part of Alberta, back in those days, mud was your biggest single enemy. And certainly McGregor's history says that west of 149th Street, that was certainly a very serious problem.
Can you talk about any unique buildings or structures that you saw in your walks as you were going around?
Back in those days, I've told you pretty well what I remember. Certainly there were always, west of 149th Street, there were always businesses along Stony Plain Road. And the limited area that my father and I walked never got close to the end of those. They went pretty far out, I think.
And would you have seen any farmhouses, farms and farmhouses?
No, not that I can recall. I think you'd probably, now you have to understand, our family didn't get an automobile till 1953 or something like that. So we didn't go far out. And the city buses never went further than 149th Street, so we never took a bus into Jasper Place. The only, I can also say that from my own experience in research is people are very quick to identify some house as having been the old farmhouse and so on, and I'd be careful about that. Often that's just a supposition and there's nothing to back that up. In fact, less than that. One thing is that in recent years, I have seen what I think is an old stable. Well, in fact, I've seen two. Now, on 95th Avenue, on the south side, couple of blocks west of 149th Street, very visible to 95th Avenue, is something that might be an old stable, but it's not quite right. It might just be a garage that had a bit of an attic. However, somewhere in that area, probably, but not certainly, a bit south of there, and probably, but certainly not west of there, I've several times had to walk past something that I think is an old stable. And, you know, this is as of a year or two ago. It is on the west side of a street, and I don't think it's too far north of the avenue. I don't remember the color of it. It's not a dark color. And the reason that I know it's a stable is that it has a pretty marked attic, and the attic has a big door at the front of it. So that's where you unload the hay from the wagon and store it up above. The other thing is that old garages are remarkably low. Now, pre-World War II automobiles are not that low, but even so, the garages would just barely got enough room to drive an ordinary sized car in, and they were narrow too. Well, I suppose that a horse and a buggy of some sort are bigger, and certainly if you're sitting up in a buggy, you're not down at the level of a 1948 car. And so the doors for the stable are wide, and needless to say, they're not overhead doors. They're the ones that are hinged on the side.